If you're upgrading from TurboLinks type Rails to modern Turbo, that's a pretty significant refactor. The actual code changes to support that aren't necessarily massive, but most of the time, a lot of the legacy JavaScript doesn't work anymore.
Welcome to SaaS That App, Building B2B Web Applications, the podcast where we share real-world stories, practical advice, and tech insights for those building or thinking about starting a tech-enabled business. I am your co-host, Aaron Marchbanks.
And I'm Justin Edwards. Each week we bring you the stories, strategies, and insights you need to build your SaaS or tech-enabled business smarter, not harder. Let's dive right in.
Hello and welcome back to SaaS That App. I am your host, as always, Aaron Marchbanks, and with us today, also as always, Justin Edwards, CIO, Master of DevOps, Senior Dev, Keeper of the Zoo at Delta Systems. Good friend, Justin, welcome back to the show.
I got my super tall wellies on for all my zookeeping.
Yes.
Stepping around all the developer poops.
Also, we have a returning guest, Daniel Cannon, Chief Innovation Officer, Senior Developer, among many other things at Delta Systems. Daniel, welcome back.
Yo, it's nice to be back.
And a first-timer, yes, from the dev team at Delta Systems, Nolan Alimonti, Senior Architect, Senior Dev, Team Lead, Master of all development and everything that he touches and surveys. Nolan, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me.
So today we are going to be diverging a bit from interview heavy and lots of business stuff. We're going to be kind of digging more into the tech side of things. And very specifically, we're going to be talking a lot about Turbo today. So I am going to send this over to my resident tech expert, Justin, to kind of level set our playing field here. Tell us a little bit about why in the world we're talking about Turbo, why I might care, what it is, and get us into some good discussion. Justin, what are we doing with Turbo?
Yeah, so just to do a little bit of definition of Turbo, this is going to be a Ruby on Rails heavy episode, as many of our episodes are. Rails is a really powerful tool that is often the right call. Turbo is a newer feature for Rails. Rails has had a feature called TurboLinks for a long time, but this kind of latest generation of Turbo is somewhat different and somewhat new. The basic gist of what Turbo does is it stops you from having to have a page load every time you do something on the site, but it does that using JavaScript to swap out page content instead of loading a whole new page in the browser, which means basically that we can get very good interactivity and a snappier, responsive feeling site without kind of doing page loads and without using a JavaScript framework. So Nolan and Daniel, tell me why that was a terrible definition or whatever I missed.
I think you pretty much nailed it. I mean, yeah, basically, Turbo was kind of how do we do single-page application stuff inside a multi-page application framework? You know, so to the developer, it still feels like you're writing a multi-page application. To the user, it feels a little bit more single-page. And so, yeah, Turbo Drive, TurboLinks was kind of like the beginning of all this, which is basically you click a link on a page, and as opposed to having a complete page load where we go all the way to the server to get all of the HTML, all the styles and everything to render the new page, instead you now make that request to the server. You say, hey, I want to go view the user profile page. And the server kind of did like a diff of like, well, these are the things that need to change on the page in order to re-render it. And so as opposed to being like, here's the brand new page, it's, well, here's the HTML to change. And then as the user, it feels like just parts of the page are changing as opposed to the entire thing getting replaced. And that has now evolved into this whole messy ecosystem where we have Turbo Stream and all sorts of other fun things. But yeah, basically the idea is you're writing Vue code on the back end. Everything kind of feels like you're doing server-side, rendering, but to the front end, everything feels very interactive. It's like you're doing Angular or React or something like that, but it's not. So it's pretty cool, pretty powerful stuff.
Would you say it seems like it feels a little Ajax-y? I mean, is that kind of the idea?
Well, yeah, I mean, Ajax is what kind of powers it under the hood. It's not obvious to you as a developer, and it's not really obvious to you as a user. And it's not what we're used to with an Ajax flow. It actually requests these like XML snippets, and the XML comes back and says, hey, replace this part of the page with this. But yeah, it is actually an asynchronous JavaScript request that's happening. So there's JavaScript code that executes in your browser that makes a request to the back end being like, hey, what do I need to change on this page? And then the server tells you, here's what you need to change.
But we have to write very little JavaScript to power these interactions.
Oh, yeah, basically none. Yeah, basically none. I mean, the applications that you can write without JavaScript now are like insane. I mean, there is JavaScript going on, but if you wanted to, you could avoid JavaScript in like 99% of cases where that would usually be the tool you would use.
Is that a good thing?
I was just about to say, that's a great question.
I don't know. What do you think?
I feel conflicted. I mean, I have a lot of experience working, in React and other front-end frameworks, single-page frameworks. I understand the desire to move away from a really client-rich JavaScript-heavy front-end. I think there was a lot of like fatigue in that ecosystem. I think it's kind of affected by like the general JavaScript shiny object syndrome, where there's kind of like a new kid on the block every other month that has like everybody's attention and everybody's jumping around, and there's, 12 frameworks to consider when you start building an app. I think the Rails decision to kind of move away from that, I think it was controversial, and I understand why it was controversial, but I think it was needed. And I do think it adds a sense of clarity to the framework itself. I do think prior to that decision, it felt like JavaScript was a requirement for building really polished kind of client-rich applications. I don't think that is the case anymore. JavaScript can be opt-in. It's an option. If you really don't want to work in JavaScript, you can probably figure out how to avoid it and still make something that feels really slick. It was probably possible before, but it was really difficult. So I think it is a good thing.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
Well, and concurrent with these changes for Turbo and that stuff kind of dropping was Stimulus substantially concurrently. Stimulus is coming at the same time, which is kind of a very compartmentalized way to have small amounts of JavaScript functionality and components, but it's a supported Rails core way of doing that. And I think that these things came out kind of at a similar time for a reason, which is that, to Nolan's point, we're kind of taking the stance of this is kind of how Rails is going to interact with these front-end frameworks. One thing that I really like about the changes that have been made is that you can still use React if that's what you want to do, turn your Rails app into an API and write your React app. There's all sorts of great and all sorts of other tools to make Rails this awesome API. But if you don't want to have those kinds of front-end problems and, see the other episode we did on single-page applications and some of the dragons there be, there's now like a really robust, nice way to not have to do that, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, it feels like there's kind of like two kinds of web developers. It's like there are those who love JavaScript and want to do everything in JavaScript, and then there are those who are trying to do as little JavaScript as is humanly possible. And I mean, there's been like this quest in the web app world. I mean, I remember working with Lyft something like 15 years ago. I'm sure nobody's heard of Lyft because why would you? But this was a Scala-based web framework, and the whole goal was like, let's not write JavaScript. Instead, you're going to write everything in Scala, and the Scala is going to define the JavaScript that gets compiled and gets executed on the client. And what really wound up happening is it was just a complete leaky abstraction. And now, as opposed to just writing JavaScript, you're writing JavaScript and then figuring out how to translate JavaScript into Scala script so that it can get translated back into JavaScript. I mean, it was just really awful. But I think it's weird how everyone wants to do zero JavaScript. There are times where JavaScript is the right tool for the job, and you should do JavaScript. You should embrace that. But yeah, trying to do everything in JavaScript or nothing in JavaScript both seem very extreme and weird to me.
So, Nolan, with your experience obviously extensively in JavaScript and certainly now with Turbo coming along, I mean, is there something about Turbo that has kind of changed your approach to organizing front end and back end or leveraging JavaScript to a certain extent?
Yeah, absolutely. It has definitely like reframed how I approach building a view or an app. I think, when I kind of started working on Rails, you had your view, and then backing that view, you probably had a really disgusting JavaScript file that was like packed with jQuery code that drove all of the interactivity, maybe just for that page, or maybe it was just part of like your general application bundle. That's gone away with these kind of new Turbo techniques. What I find more frequently is that we'll have really limited JavaScript kind of sprinkled throughout the application, generally through like reusable stimulus controllers. So just one example might be like, we'll have kind of a general purpose form stimulus controller that has a couple of like callbacks for submit so that, we show a loading overlay while that submit operation is happening so the user can't, click on some other element on the page or shows a loading message or disables a button or whatever. And the really nice thing is that if you build those stimulus modules like in a general purpose way, you can generally just extend them as needed, but reuse them throughout the entire application. So it's really rare to encounter kind of duplicated JavaScript at this point if you're using these tools in the way that I think they are intended to be used. We definitely still use a ton of JavaScript. It's hard to build rich user interactivity without JavaScript. But I think if you compared the amount of JS we write now compared to what we used to write, 5 or 8 years ago, like there's no comparison. We write a very small amount compared to back then.
It's less, and it's also so much more reused. Like the average reusability of a line of JavaScript has just gone through the roof, mostly thanks to Stimulus and this kind of encapsulated way that the Rails has rolled out for encapsulating these JavaScript components.
Well, that's always part of the goal too. I mean, the reusability, is going to at some point equal scalability, and you're just going to help your environment, your application overall, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, another cool thing that Rails introduced somewhat recently are view components. I don't actually know when these came out, but relatively recent, like I think within the last couple years. First project I ever worked with that had them was like a year or two ago. So yeah, view components are like super powerful, and it's such a simple abstraction. It's like, it's almost embarrassing how simple the abstraction is. It's basically just, well, we're going to have some view code, that's for this component. And we're going to have some Ruby code. That's the things that the view code needs to render itself. And then you can have a style sheet that targets the component. And then you create a stimulus controller. And so you end up with this like almost like an Angular style component. And like the actual work that makes this happen is like minor. Like, I mean, you could implement view components. It's not that complicated. I mean, it's got some cool features like slots and stuff like that I don't have to get into. But like, it's basically just a way of kind of encapsulating it. And so now you have like, oh, you have your form component. Anytime you need to render a form, you just say, all right, render a new form component, or my action button component, render a new action button. And it just leads to these really small files that describe a little bit of functionality that you can then pepper all throughout the application. And it was really missing from Rails before. Like it had partials and things like that, but components are super powerful.
I feel like that is one of the things that the Rails ecosystem did borrow from like React and other kind of front-end frameworks, where all of that is based on kind of this component pattern thinking. And I think that was missing from Rails prior to tools like Turbo and gems like View Component. And I think I do see a lot more of that now, where instead of approaching kind of like all of the markup and code for a single view, you think about it more at a component level or a widget level, which I think makes for a much more maintainable code base.
Yeah, but could it not also get messy, though, with so many components? I mean, obviously, if you got a relatively straightforward form or an application or something like that, it's not a big deal. But if you got something with a lot of complexity, aren't you going to start to run into some messes with so many different components?
I mean, I think it depends on how you organize the code base. I've yet to encounter a project where we had so many components that they were hard to manage. I think a much more complicated problem is sorting through, a view file that's many thousands of lines long, or a super bloated JavaScript file. That those are the problematic files that we get paid to fix. Typically, if you're encapsulating logic into a couple of related files, it becomes a lot easier to work with.
Totally. One thing I love about how Rails did components too is if you do a component in Angular, you have this like self-contained world where that component can't talk to anything else. It's got these really rigid rules about how things work, which seems cool. It seems like it leads to greater reuse and all of that. But in practice, I've always found it to be really frustrating. And Ruby's approach or Rails approach is kind of a little bit like being, well, we have objects, but they're kind of fuzzy. It's just kind of everything Ruby. It's like, well, we have components, but if you want to write a style sheet that reaches outside of the component and does something else, you can. If you want to have this controller talk to other controllers in a really unstructured way, like, well, you can do that. It's like you're kind of a little unshackled in how you want to go about doing this, which can get you in trouble too, but I find it very useful in a lot of places.
Well, it's just in line with being a Ruby dev, right? We're nasty and we want to go around the rules, and we're like, oh, it's really cool that these systems exist or are in place, and that's great when we use them. But also like, this time I don't want to use it. This time I'm going to reach into the guts of this other thing and do what I need to do. And Ruby devs tend to kind of like that stuff. It's one of the reasons the .NET kids have their skin crawl when they talk to us. So,
So Daniel, you'd mentioned a couple of these like key parts of Turbo. You talked about Drive, you talked about frames, there's streams. I think those are maybe the three primary kind of key parts to Turbo. Can you break each of those down for our listeners? Drive, frames, and streams?
Sure, yeah. And Nolan might actually be the better one to talk about this, but I can try to do my best here. Yeah, I mean, Turbo Drive is sort of what powers TurboLinks. So that's when you click on a link and have it load a page somewhat seamlessly. A Turbo Frame is really just like a tag you put in the HTML where you say, hey, this is my Turbo Frame. So like this is my modal frame, or this is my form frame. And so you give that thing a name, and a lot of conventions have come about for how to name those. We kind of follow this pattern where we take like the class name underscore or some property of it underscore the ID. So you'd be like, this is contact 73 new form, for example. So that's basically you're just giving like a little chunk of the HTML a name. And then Turbo Stream is the thing that actually does the update. So you call your controller and you give it a request type of Turbo Stream, and you say, I want you to update the contact 72 new form. And it then responds with an XML snippet, which is just a small XML snippet that says, all right, what you need to do in order to execute this request is you need to replace the new form with this. And you also need to replace this button with this. And you also need to replace the status bar with this. And then the browser, the JavaScript bundle running inside of the web application goes and makes those updates to the view. Is that more or less right, Nolan? What did I get wrong?
That's all right. I would add about Turbo Frames in that each frame potentially has its own navigation context, which unlocks some really cool kind of patterns that we didn't have prior to Turbo Frames. So you can almost, if you want it to be, you can almost think about a frame kind of being like a mini app within the shell of your outer application. So if you nest a form within a Turbo frame and click on the submit button, and the server responds with content within a matching Turbo frame, Turbo is smart enough to only update the content within those matching frames and will leave the outer markup alone. So you can update widgets on a dashboard without affecting the rest of the page, which becomes a really powerful unlock when you start to figure out how to compose those things.
Starting to sound like nesting.
Yeah, it is. You're kind of nesting mini apps within a greater app.
That's a great point. Like if you have a table, for example, and you want to put a search bar on top of it, you don't really want to reload the entire page every time somebody presses a keystroke. And so, there's the old school JavaScript way where you go and fetch your JSON to update your list and you update your list. But now you basically, you give the table its own tag. You say, this is the table frame and this is the search frame. And then as you type, you just automatically submit the form, like as if it's a normal form, and you just post it back to the server. And the server comes back and updates just the table snippet, and it leaves your search bar and your filters and it leaves everything else alone, which is super cool.
So in the turbo frame, the server's responding with just, a little bit of meta information and then also just the HTML needed to show that current version of the table. It's less data in transit and it feels much more interactive. It feels zippy like a front-end application, but it requires writing zero JavaScript, and it does not require, biting off one of these giant frameworks, which is a big architectural decision, adds members to the team, that kind of thing. Nolan, you had demoed something a while back, or maybe we have a customer who was using something where you were actually using WebSockets and pushing updates through a stream, right? Do you remember what that was?
I do, yeah. So a server response can include a turbo stream. It can tell the DOM to update, replace a certain section of the DOM with this new content. But you can also broadcast turbo streams outside of a request response. So for instance, you can hook into a callback in your user object so that when, user Joe updates his email, there is a WebSocket broadcast event to all subscribers of that stream, and they see that update in their DOM in real time. So the server is telling the client to update outside of the request context, which is, you can do that from a background job, for instance. So let's say you have a really kind of heavy async report process running in the background. That report can broadcast updates to users in the browser through that turbo stream mechanism, which is really cool.
Super cool. No, that's awesome.
Practically what that looks like is you click on a button to run a report. You're sitting on the same page. There's no polling happening. So you're just kind of hanging out on that same page. That job, maybe it spins up a whole worker process and does a bunch of cloud stuff in the background. The job tells the server when it's done rendering the report, it broadcasts that it's done. And then that automatically pushes from the server to your client to say, hey, this report's ready, and turns it green and enables a download button or something. But without, it's kind of turning the whole paradigm on its head, where instead of you asking the server for information, the server's telling you when something's ready, which again just adds to that interactivity and makes things feel really smooth, really seamless.
Yeah, this all sounds great, guys. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. It can't be all good. So what's the bad and ugly?
Yeah, things are harder. Things take more work, especially to make things feel smooth. You will have to do more work to get there if you're working in kind of the default standard Rails tooling of Turbo and Stimulus. If you want to make a super slick, really interactive table for your users index, it's probably going to take a lot more work to get there unless you're just using an off-the-shelf package to do that. If you're rolling that all on your own, it's going to take a lot to get there. But with that added complexity, you're also kind of eliminating a lot of complexity in terms of, a huge part of this is you're closer to your source of truth. You are closer to your database, and you're using that data to render your view almost directly. So there are fewer layers of interpretation. So even though it takes longer, I do think that the output is often better.
Okay. Yeah. I think that a lot of what you said is very true there. I think a lot of stuff is very confusing to step into if you're not familiar with it. I think that's probably one of the biggest issues with Turbo is it is a real mind bender when you first step in of what is going on. I click this new link, and then where does the actual new stuff happen? It's in the controller, and does this weird render terms? It's a little weird and unintuitive, especially Stimulus. If you're coming in as an old school JavaScript developer and trying to use Stimulus, it is so frustrating where you're just I just want to do $, give me the button. And it's no, you can't do that. You got this whole this.element thing and targets and values. And it's a very new way of writing JavaScript. So I think it's very confusing to start with when you first get into it. It's also, it's the typical Rails stuff where everything is just, convention over configuration. And so there's not a lot that's done explicitly. It's kind of, if you don't know the patterns that are in use in the project, you will be lost. You will be absolutely lost. And a lot of those conventions are emerging. The tooling's there, but everybody's doing their own kind of thing with it. I have patterns that I follow in my projects, and then I step into projects that Nolan's working on. It's oh, well, these are different patterns. They're not necessarily wrong. They're just not the patterns that I use. And so I'm very lost and confused. And I think vice versa. So that is a challenge that I don't think a lot of this stuff has matured to the level of other things where there are clear conventions and patterns about how to do this stuff. So yeah, I think those are drawbacks. You got anything, Justin?
Debugging is super hard. Some of this is just it's new and it's bleeding edge, but yeah, just following the control flow through the application. When you kind of add in stimulus and these turbo streams, like it becomes more difficult. It's not as obvious to you as the person writing the code what's actually happening as you're working on it. So working with turbos the first time in a long time, I found myself digging into requests on my Chrome console to like see what the server's responding with and why. I don't really do that very often because I have a good sense of what's happening usually. But yeah, trying to debug things that are not going right in Turbo, it's just harder. It's a different skill set. It's new, so people aren't great at it yet. If we're getting better, I'm sure. This is basically an analog or an add-on to Nolan's point, which he said it takes longer to get to something that's great. And I'm saying that, and once you have something that's great, it's harder to keep it working well and fix issues with it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, every kind of framework language has their own kind of like cryptic errors that you just get used to saying. Like, when you're writing C, it's segmentation fault. What on earth does segmentation fault? And like, the land of Turbo is content missing. That's your cryptic error that you get all the time where your customer's like, content missing. And what that means is it tried to request Turbo and it got back HTML. And why did it get back HTML? Because it got back an error. But like, as opposed to getting a nice red screen like you're used to getting in Rails that tells you what's going wrong, you just get content missing or nothing happens. Might even be more common than content missing. It's just nothing happens and you have no idea why. So yeah, that's hard, getting errors to the users. And it also makes it easy to write things like that, which are going to be not obvious to the user, because in the past, if you clicked a button and you got a red screen, the user at least knows something wrong. Now the user just doesn't get any feedback that anything's happened. So they think what they tried to do worked and it didn't. So yeah, those are all definitely problems.
Definitely have seen issues too where someone bookmarks something and what they end up bookmarking if they just visit that URL is a Turbo thing. It's not a whole site. So instead of seeing a component rendered or the site like it's supposed to work, you just get code out. And so there's like users will say, I went to the site and it just was showing me the source code. And it's like, well, that's kind of true, but it's a thing that's easy to write now. And it's another thing for us to keep track of as developers when we're working with these tools.
And that's one that's so easy to fix. Like, you just need to not be lazy and fix it. That's a fault for me because, yeah, I've seen this all the time too. You have that where you control click on a link to open in a new tab and then like, oh, it opens in a new tab. And then what you see is just like, XML vomit. And like the fix there is you modify your controller to only respond to Turbo stream requests. And if somebody requests HTML, you either give them proper HTML or you give them like an error or something as opposed to this XML snippet. It's super easy to fix. It's just who has time for that.
Well, to Nolan's point about, this takes quite a bit more forethought and certainly more work and effort to get it working the way that you want, awesomeness aside when you're done. And to Daniel's point about the patterns and getting someone new involved in a project or up to speed on something, it's feeling like something that would be more suited for like a V2 or later and not so much like an MVP sort of situation. Is that a fair statement?
I want to hear Nolan's take on that first.
I think it depends, whether or not that person is a Rails dev. If you're a Rails dev and you're starting from zero on a new project, I think the case for deviating from like the recommended tooling and setup of a Rails app, which is now Turbo and Stimulus, like you need to have a really good reason to make that configuration decision. I think in general, like even if it's a little bit more work to implement these interactive elements, the simplicity of staying within the bounds of the framework and the tooling is worth it. It's easier to maintain. It's easier to onboard new folks. Web projects inevitably have people kind of come in and out. Sometimes they're worked on concurrently by multiple people. I think the more standardized things are and the more in line they are with the framework best practices, the easier it is in the long run.
Justin, did you have a counterpoint to that, or were you just waiting to see if you were going to agree?
Yeah, no, I just don't want to poison the well. I think that's right. I guess I view this as like yet another thing that someone has to learn before they can be considered like a talented Rails dev. And I just feel like the amount of stuff that you need to know and the awareness that you need to have, like it's just gotten so much harder to start out becoming a Rails dev because it used to be a kind of a short path to get to like a basic level of competency for Rails. And I think as we've continued to add more and more complexities, it's just further and further away. And I know that people talk about like AIs are going to be our junior level devs and all that. But I think as these things continue to get more and more difficult, it's harder for me to imagine somebody kind of crossing the chasm. Just the number of things you have to know to be like base level competent to work on a Rails project is just huge now. So I guess that's kind of my concern with it.
Well, and does it muddy the water between what would be considered a front-end dev and a back-end dev?
That I don't think it does. I think Stimulus specifically, I think, is a great tool for backend devs who begrudgingly write JavaScript. It's kind of a very compartmentalized way to write as little JavaScript as possible. That'd be my take on it anyway. I think that someone who's like a really great JavaScript front-end dev is going to find this to be really restrictive and annoying. Did you have a fun on that, Daniel, or did we cover it?
The first question was, should you use this for prototyping? I guess my counterpoint to that would be prototypes don't die. I have a Java.
What?
I have a Java.
What? Wait, no, you're incorrect.
Yeah, I have a Java application that I wrote, I think, 15 years ago. The project was named Prototype. That was the name of the project. I'm not going to say who it was for or where it is, but I will say that it is still a production application that is still used every day, and it's called Prototype. So yeah, prototypes don't die. I mean, you can make your prototype extremely awful, like have ChatGPT generate it for you, and then maybe it will die, but otherwise it's still going to be around. So I would say if you're going down the route of building an MVP, you should build it the right way from the get-go. I think all this turbo stuff actually makes you much faster as a developer. To Nolan's point, you have to know how to do it. If you don't know how to do it, it's going to slow you down. But if you're familiar with it, it should go pretty quick. Arguably doing Node or something is maybe going to be a faster prototyping tool. But personally, I would do it in Rails and I would absolutely use Turbo. Yeah, and I think that knowing Turbo is now just table stakes for being a Rails dev. I mean, unless you're maintaining some old application from 8 years ago, which even then it's like, well, you're going to have to maintain and upgrade that at some point. I mean, Turbo is just now, this is part of how Rails work is done. So it's not excusable to not know it. But you don't have to know CoffeeScript anymore. So, we've given up one thing and now you have to learn a different thing.
So I haven't done this side of things because most of the work that I've done that's been Turbo, since Turbo has been greenfield stuff. I don't know if you have any experience with this, Nolan or Daniel, but how does layering in Turbo stuff to sites that aren't using that, like if we have maybe an older Rails site that we're keeping up to date and now we're trying to write new features into like an older site, do either of you have experience with that? How does it go?
As far as I'm concerned, like if you're upgrading from TurboLinks type Rails to modern Turbo, that's a pretty significant refactor. The actual code changes to support that aren't necessarily massive, but most of the time, a lot of the legacy JavaScript doesn't work anymore because it's kind of set up to work with the TurboLinks style of page update, which no longer really applies. Turbo introduced a bunch of new events that you now have to consider, and like the lifecycle of the page has changed pretty significantly. So we have done that a couple of times where we've migrated, from Rails 5 to Rails 7 or 8 and done kind of a complete Turbo overhaul. It's a big endeavor. I mean, I think all of the projects we've done that on, it has absolutely been worth it. Like the project is so much easier to work on now. It's much more maintainable. It generally cleans up a ton of cruft. Yeah, I don't know. It feels really good to watch all the jQuery JavaScript get blown away. Like never see it again.
Yeah, from the DevOps side, it's great for me too, because Rails core is doing most or all the heavy lifting, and now I have a lot less work that I have to do to kind of cram JavaScript and Rails together, which from DevOps and deployments is super annoying. So it's made my life better from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the business side of things, I'm recognizing that this is more like an HTML or XML, over the wire. How does that play into things like SEO? Is it still reasonable? Is it still pretty friendly? Or does this add layers of complexity to that?
So when we complain on other podcasts about server-side rendering and how silly it is to do that, and how JavaScript front-end single-page applications make that necessary, this is basically server-side rendered by default. So you get all the SEO advantages and everything that going through the process of doing server-side rendering would do for you on a front-end application, but it's just designed to work that way. So I would say there's zero or close to zero SEO hit. The only thing I could think of is that if Google or others can't figure out how to interact in a way to initiate some of these requests, then that would be problematic. So some of your site content is invisible to Google, but any front-end application or any kind of JavaScript containing application is going to have that issue potentially.
Yeah, you could definitely introduce some anti-patterns that would make this not great for SEO, but I think they're pretty avoidable. And if you know that you're building a marketplace page and you want to have all the text of all the things on it, don't load those via Turbo requests. So, I mean, there are some pitfalls that you could do that, where it's you're trying to make your initial page load really fast. So you load this initially and then you do everything else via Turbo. That's going to totally break with the web crawler because it's not going to execute the JavaScript to populate the page. But I almost feel like you'd have to go pretty far out of your way to make things that aren't SEO friendly going this route.
Yeah, what Daniel was just describing, that would be work to write. If you just write it the way that it's intended to be used, it's not going to have that problem at all.
Yeah, in general, working with Turbo, what you see on the page as a developer is much closer to what the end user is actually going to get in the browser. I think I've encountered many more scenarios using Next.js, where the line between kind of the server-side code and the client code is much more obfuscated. It's hard to see that line. Here it becomes really obvious. You pretty much know exactly what you're going to see on the page as a developer. And I think that does make SEO quite a bit simpler.
It keeps all of our view code together as well. And that kind of ties in. I mean, all these features came out at a similar time, but the view components, the stimulus, and Turbo, these things kind of coming out together is just really cleaned up, to Nolan's point. the organization, project structure organization is much simpler now. We don't have random styles living in some folder named JavaScript off and like some other, because for a while there with like Webpacker and stuff, it got to feel like, oh, this is a Rails app and it has this weird JavaScript engine kind of bolted onto the side of it. They're kind of like cancerously intertwined. Whereas now, like everything top to bottom, including where the JavaScript goes, feels like a Rails project. Like from like a feeling happy and clean as a developer, it's been a nice quality of life improvement.
I do wish that the Rails folks would actually come up with a slightly better way to compartmentalize CSS, though, if I can add one complaint on that. I've sort of followed some patterns in my projects where it's like every time you create a component, you create a CSS file named for that component, and every component you kind of give the name of like, dot form submission component kind of thing so that you can target it directly with CSS, but it still feels kludgy. And like when you work in an Angular app, you have a CSS file inside your Angular component, and that CSS file works just for the Angular component. So it'd be nice if they would add some kind of way to compartmentalize CSS that it doesn't feel quite so gross.
So Nolan, I'm curious, have you hit any walls using Turbo? I mean, is there something that you get to a particular point and it either doesn't do it because it's just not mature enough yet, or it's easier to do it a different way? Have you hit some functional walls?
Sure. Yeah. When we start a new project, one of the earliest questions we ask is like, would it be appropriate to build this as an SPA using like a modern JavaScript framework? And the conditions for answering that with a yes would be like, it's highly interactive. There's a certain like level of interactivity where you're just going to be beating your head against the wall trying to recreate that with server-side rendering snippets of JavaScript. It's just going to become super unwieldy.
Can you define that though? Like, what does that look like?
It's typically not like a business CRUD app, which is most of the apps that we wind up building. I'm thinking of something much more like consumer facing, where kind of like super slick micro interactions and like, tons of stuff sliding in and out. And like, that's maybe mobile first would be kind of a good candidate for that. But for a business application where those things are much less important than kind of the usability, the functionality, serving the business needs, like it's pretty rare where we encounter a project where we don't think we can do a good job with Rails and these tools.
If you think about like a calculator website, Aaron, like if someone had like a tax calculator or something where you change one number and then 35 charts and all the different, like that number propagates through like 25 other calculations. And so like, as you're making adjustments to that number, everything about the whole page is changing. Anything that looks kind of like that, you're going to want to use a SPA for. I wrote a character sheet for a D&D hobby, and it's like weights of items that are on the characters. There's a ton of calculations that are based off of like the character strength and the level and what they're carrying and all that. And that would be miserable to write using Turbo. That's just a case for an SPA, but it's like there's so much interactivity between all these numbers and you want to see 35 things update instantaneously. So that's the kind of thing that I would use that for.
Rails 8 rolled out this idea of TurboMorph, or I guess this tool TurboMorph, which is kind of an add-on to TurboStream's frames and Drive. And I believe it's using a package called Idiomorph or Morph DOM. I'm not sure which one under the hood, which allows you to do kind of finer grained like DOM diffing and updates in place without swapping out large sections of the HTML body. What you wind up with is the ability to redirect back to the same page that made the request and see all of the new content updated on the page while still maintaining the previous DOM state. So something that Justin described where like one value change should kind of propagate out to the entire page. You can very much do that with TurboMorph. It still is happening as a single request, but to the end user, it really does feel much more kind of single page app-ish where like everything feels smooth. If they had a details HTML element that was open, it would continue to be open on reload because that DOM diffing process didn't actually mutate that element that hadn't changed in the response.
How would that work with something like an interactive chart, though, or something? Like, say, it's going to add a dot to the line chart, and you've got 1,000 dots in your line chart.
If your line chart is based on JavaScript, yeah, you would either have to like do that JavaScript update manually, or you would have to re-render the chart. This is really just going to be for HTML that's updating on the fly, not for JavaScript-enabled stuff.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think if you have something that's like super interactive, think like Lucid Chart or, anything where it's just, no, you're going to want to do this pretty much JavaScript top to bottom. But yeah, I do think that the capabilities of Ruby to do this stuff are expanding. I mean, I agree that it's how much interactivity do you need? And if it's a lot, you might want to go a different direction. If it's going to be less interactive, probably Ruby's the right call.
Another thing to consider on that kind of continuum of what to choose is how much work is the user going to do that the server never needs to be aware of? If that's a huge number, then you're just wasting a lot of time and energy communicating. Like I was thinking of like Canva or like a web-based photo editor. Like I care about that when I save it. The server doesn't need to know what I'm doing with the image until I save it. I don't need every step along the way, asterisks, maybe some auto-saving or something like that. So that'd be another case where a front-end application or a SPA makes more sense. It's just like, oh yeah, the user is going to be working on this for a long time and the server only needs to care about it at very specific points in time.
Let me add one little tag along to that, though. If the server doesn't know about it, you can't use it for analytics. So that is, I think, something to consider, is that when you have this world where every request is going back to the server, it makes it very easy to hook in and track, oh, okay, the user searched for letter Q, the user searched for QU, the user searched for QUE. Maybe that data is not useful, but it could be useful, or if you're trying to track where somebody's scrolling on the page or things like there are ways to do this using other tools, obviously, but if it's all going directly to your server, it actually creates one centralized point to plug in and capture those analytics.
Yeah, but you got to think the analytics are also going to mature and develop around that as well.
Mm-hmm.
The point that Justin and Daniel just made, I think it's interesting. Yeah, there are scaling concerns with these turbo patterns because pretty much every kind of user click is probably going to kick off a network request. And if you are operating at scale, if every link click or, table sort change or whatever triggers a network request and your server can't handle it, you now have kind of a new scaling problem to solve. So for apps at scale, I mean, truly talking about, hundreds of thousands or millions of concurrent users, like these patterns might not make sense for you anymore, but obviously, at that stage of your product life, like you have a lot of options and you can figure out
right.
what it's.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, we talked about this a lot on the spa episode, right? Where it's like, if you are Facebook, do not use Rails. Like there's a reason that they created React, but probably if you're a little startup and you're just kind of getting going, you're probably not Facebook. You do need to solve different problems.
Well, and this came through by way of Hotwire, right? And they did Basecamp.
Yes, I think these are all tools developed by 37 Signals, who are the core maintainers and contributors for Rails. These are frameworks and tools that they've built, and they're now kind of just packaging as a part of Rails out of the box.
Yeah, we used to use Basecamp, and I mean, it was great for what it did until it tried to be too much, I think. Like most mature applications do, I want to be everything to everyone all the time instead of just staying in the lane. But it was a very cool application while we used it.
You mean you don't find Jira simple, easy to configure, and easy to use?
Oh, sweet Jesus. I especially like the permissions controls. Those are outstandingly well done.
I have a really simple trick to make Jira absolutely, completely user-friendly, seamless to use. Anytime you have a Jira problem, you just go, Daniel.
Hello.
Then I don't have to deal with it anymore. So
it just goes away and magically comes back solved.
Just don't ask me for more columns, please. I'm so tired of adding columns to people's workflows. Like, do you really need that column? Can't we just have the same columns?
Yeah, Daniel, I got like a 24-inch screen, man. I could get one more on there easily. It'd still see it.
Why it's so hard to add columns, I have no idea, but I'm very good at it at this point. So
cool. Probably ready to take us home, Aaron?
Yeah, guys, it's been great. I love getting to chat with you guys about this sort of stuff. And for me, as the least technical out of this group, it's always educational, and it's really fun to kind of get to roll some of this new stuff around and hear where we're going. So really appreciate your time once again with us today. And I'll go in reverse order of experience on the pod. We'll start back with Nolan Alimonti again. First timer here, senior dev, senior architect, team lead. As I said, master of all, as you have heard today. Nolan, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun.
And Daniel Cannon, Chief Innovation Officer, outstanding devil's advocate, player, among many other things. Daniel, thank you as always.
I've never had a contrarian point of view in my life. I don't know what you're talking about.
And thank you for making my point there. And Justin, always appreciate you being in the co-pilot seat here for SaaS That App.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad I was able to come along and take notes from these guys who have a lot more experience with the turbo stuff than I do. So got Turbomorph added to the list of things that I should probably know about. So thanks for that, Noel.
You need to say it like Turbomorph. You got to...
Turbomorph.
There you go. There you go. Well, once again, thanks so much to our listeners. If you like what you're hearing, give us a subscribe. If you want to hear more, have some ideas for podcasts or topics going forward, please feel free to send those our way. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you all next time on SaaS That App. Thanks for cruising along with us on SaaS That App. We hope you grabbed some insights that were inspiring, actionable, or at least entertaining.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
Until next time, keep building, keep growing, and keep those apps sassy.